Hello everybody, it's Foxy speaking and welcome to another episode of Foxy's Fun Inspirational Chats. And today I will be your host. In this episode, this episode is a story about a nice little family who live in a little seaside village in a nice location over in England. The little seaside village was comprised of some nice little cottages that were not terribly far from the seaside. There lived a little boy named Rodrigo. Rodrigo was English, but he was born to an English mother and a Spanish father. His Spanish father, Francisco, emigrated to the United Kingdom many, many years before he was born. And obviously, sometime in his lifetime, whilst it had been quite a few years since he was living and working in the United Kingdom, he met with his mother and obviously they met, got married and had him. And his mother, whose name was Olive, is English. Rodrigo was proud of both his British and Spanish heritage, and he was also felt very fortunate to live in a nice seaside village near the seaside, because it meant he could go and play in the seaside or go in the sea whenever the summer season came along. And so yes, it was now the summer season, and it was in the morning. The sunshine light beamed and shone through the cottage window, through the cottage window which led to the bedroom of Rodrigo himself. Rodrigo was soundly sleeping until his eyes slowly but steadily began to open, and before he knew it, he looked only to see a huge shine of light reflecting up to his face, and looked out of the window only to see that it was a nice sunny day. He knew what this meant. He meant it was the day to go to the seaside, especially as it was a Saturday. And he had just finished school for the summer. And so he jumped out of his bed, leaping with excitement, and began running over to his parents' bedroom to wake them up. Oh, good morning, Rodrigo. Settle down, my boy, said Francisco, his father. You're full of energy. Please slow down a little, he said. But luckily he wasn't saying it grumpily. He understood his son was young, but he was just a little surprised at how much energy he had in an early morning, because obviously it was going to take Francisco and Olive, Rodrigo's parents, much time to form their energy before the day is fully begun. All right, Rodrigo son. I shall be getting up this moment immediately, Francisco said. And so Francisco, Rodrigo's father, got out of bed and walked over to the bathroom to have his shower. He had his shower, and once he'd finished in the shower, he went into the bedroom, got himself dressed, and ran a morning bath for his son, Rodrigo. After Francisco had finished washing up Rodrigo, who got out of the bath once he was completely washed up. And once he was completely washed up, Francisco helped his son Rodrigo to comb up his hair nicely and got him dressed ready for the seaside. He dressed him in his swimming trunks and a nice children's Hawaiian shirt. He too dressed up in his swimming shorts and Hawaiian shirt as well, as Francisco did, very like his son Rodrigo. Olive, however, was dressed in a casual wear. But Rodrigo and Francisco were more than happy with it and were certainly not bothered as to how Olive looked like when dressing up for going to the seaside. Before long, once everyone was washed and dressed, the family had a nice Spanish breakfast together. And once they had their Spanish breakfast, they went to the seaside. Down on the seaside it was very hot. It was a nice hot summer heat wave which started very, very early for the summer season, since Rodrigo had just finished school for the summer holidays. He went onto the beach, into the sandy part. He got out his bucket and spade, and he and his father helped to build a sand castle. They tipped the bucket over, tapped it gently with the spade, and once 10-15 seconds had passed, they pulled up the bucket and, hey presto, they made a sand castle. Once Rodrigo's mother, Olive, saw this, she got out her camera and took a picture of her son Rodrigo and her husband, Francisco, also Rodrigo's father, of them looking crouched down beside the sandcastle, smiling. It was going to go in the family photo album. So once that was done, they decided to go to the pebbles. Rodrigo liked pebbles on the seaside because he liked to see whether a pebble could bounce on the sea. And before long, after they made another sandcastle, and Rodrigo and his father Francisco had another photograph of them taken, after getting another sandcastle done, they walked over to the pebble zone of the seaside. Francisco always liked to go first. Rodrigo's father, when throwing a beach pebble. And so he picked up a beach pebble, took careful aim and used careful coordination, and gave a little gentle chuck with the beach pebble. After he took aim and coordination, the pebble just splashed right into the water and did not bounce once. Ah! Oh, hard luck! I was so close, Francisco said. Go on, my son. You give a go. He helped his son with his coordination and careful aim to chuck the pebble. He did it as carefully as he could, taking aim, which was what Rodrigo did, with the assistance of his father to help him with the chucked aim, and then they gave a little throw. But the result was the same. Splash! the pebble did not once bounce on the seawater. "Ah!" Francisco said. "Oh, no! We were so close." "Never mind. Come on. Time for some fish and chips. You can never miss fish and chips on the seaside," Francisco said. Rodrigo knew that his father was right. Having fish and chips on the seaside was always the best occasion. Before long, Rodrigo and his parents, Francisco and Olive, had their fish and chips. But Rodrigo could not help but feel disappointed about his unsuccessful attempt in getting a beach pebble to bounce on the sea. "What's the matter, son?" Francisco asked his son Rodrigo curiously. "Dad, I couldn't get the beach pebble to bounce on the sea," he said sadly. "Ah, never mind," he said. "Sometimes they bounce, or sometimes not. You know, they could be a little fish or a little invisible eel. Sometimes big, mostly small, that could help bounce off your pebble before it goes into the deep zone of the sea. So, you can't always be in luck, son, but sometimes special luck can find you." Rodrigo still felt disappointed, but he knew that his father was right. And so they finished off their fish and chip lunch, and once it was time the fish and chip lunch was over, it was time for Rodrigo and his father to swim in the sea. They had a little swim in the sea, but they did not swim off into the deep zone. Well, Rodrigo did not swim off into the deep zone, but it was his father who would sometimes swim far out to sea. But luckily he knew what he was doing, and as to not swim into a dangerous zone of the sea, where there would be dangerous sea creatures, or dangerous killer whales. He never swam in that zone. So Francisco was safe, and Rodrigo and Olive did not have to worry about Francisco, because he would always swim in a safer zone far out to sea. Before long, it was time to go home. All three were fairly sunburnt, but had luckily, well, Rodrigo was a little bit sunburnt, Olive was slightly sunburnt, but Francisco was nothing but tanned. He could sometimes get a sunburn, but he generally tanned in the sunshine whenever going out to the beach. And so, as they got home, they shower off all the sand and sea stuff, having been on the beach for some time. And once they were showered up, they had their dinner, a nice Spanish meal. And once they had the Spanish meal, Francisco put on the television as a means of entertainment for his son, and put on a children's program for him, which would obviously entertain his son before going to bed. Rodrigo watched the television program, and the television program he was watching was the cartoon Looney Tunes. He always found Looney Tunes very, very amusing, and certainly did he enjoy Looney Tunes very much. Before long it was bedtime. "Good night, son," Francisco said. "Good night, Rodrigo," Olive said, Rodrigo's mother. "Good night, Mum and Dad," Rodrigo said. And before long they turned out the lights, carefully closed the door, and Rodrigo fell peacefully to sleep. Though he still had disappointment over his failure, he knew one day that luck might one day find him, as they were going to go on the beach again the next day. It was Sunday. They repeated the routine of getting up out of bed, having a bath, a Spanish breakfast, and then off to the seaside. But as it was Sunday, they were not going to be on the seaside all day this time. They were only going to be on the seaside for a bit of the morning until lunchtime, so that they could have their Sunday roast and go to the fun fair on the Sunday. This time they were only going to go to the pebble zone of the beach and have a swim. But before they were going to go for a swim in the sea, Rodrigo decided to take another good go at throwing a beach pebble on the sea to make sure it would bounce. Once they got to the pebble zone, before Francisco could instruct his son on swimming in the sea in a further zone, he was like, "Well, son, wait a minute, Dad, I'm going to show something." Francisco was surprised, but could see his son could show something to him and Olive that could make both of them proud. And so Rodrigo picked up a pebble, he stopped at a zone, he took as careful aim as he could without the assistance of his parents. He began to aim back and forward, back and forward, holding tightly the beach pebble in his hand, back and forward, back and forward, back and forward, back and forward, until he released the beach pebble. It flew into the air and then bounced. It bounced once on the sea, and then bounce, another bounce, after bounce, another bounce, and another bounce. Both Francisco, Olive, and Rodrigo watched in amazement. And another bounce, a bounce, a bounce, a bounce, until after 10 bounces it splashed into the sea. Rodrigo could hardly believe his eyes on the result. Both Rodrigo's parents, Francisco and Olive, were nothing more than amazed with the result. Francisco ran over to his son Rodrigo. He was like, 10 bounces on this of a beach pebble on the sea. How did you do that? You must be a magic. You could be a magician, he said proudly to his son. I just tried as carefully as I could, Dad, Rodrigo said. Well, you are a magic. You should be a magician. 10 bounces on a beach with a beach pebble on the beach sea. That's unusual. That's a magician trick, Francisco said. You could one day try to be a magician one day if you wanted to, Olive said. I mean, it's certainly very unusual to see a result of a beach pebble bouncing on the sea 10 times or more. Doesn't happen for many people. Rodrigo knew that what his mother said was more or less true. Come on, Rodrigo, Francisco said. It's swim time. And so they took off their Hawaiian shirts and jumped into the sea and began swimming in the sea together. Though they were not going to swim in a deep zone, they were going to swim further out to sea together, provided they did not go into a very deep zone, and they were not going to swim underwater in the slightest. Before long, it was time for them to swim back to the shore and once they got back to the shore, they dried themselves off with their towels and put on their Hawaiian shirts and walked back home, ready to have their Sunday lunch. And Rodrigo, on his way home for his Sunday lunch, after being on the seaside, could not help but think about what a wonderful surprise he had received after he chucked a beach pebble stone and it bounced 10 times on the sea, purely out of surprise. He knew that if he could achieve this surprise once, he knew he could achieve this surprise again, should special luck find him or find his way. The end. Thanks everybody indeed for watching. If at any point I got lost for words when issuing out this story in this latest episode of the Foxy's Fun Inspirational Chat series, I am extremely sorry. But thanks all indeed everybody all the same for watching this very video. Ta-ta, another time. From Foxy.